Hello, it's Scott Manley here. While it didn't make it to the moon, Astrobotic's Peregrine lander did return a whole bunch of images from deep space, and one image in particular caught a lot of people's attention, and they asked me what the heck is a can of Pocari Sweat doing on a spacecraft. And for those of you that don't know, Pocari Sweat is a Japanese hydration drink. It's kind of salty. The idea is that it's supposed to, get that fluid into your body more quickly and more efficiently by doing that. But yeah, it's never quite took off in the West. But yeah, this is something that you may have heard of. It's space advertising. I mean, seriously, right? You can imagine in this modern commercial, space flight environment that advertising on your spacecraft kind of makes sense if you want to offset the cost. There was also a collaboration with DHL, which presumably we're going to get some sort of advertising return on delivering stuff to the surface of the moon. Unfortunately, they ended up delivering stuff back into the Earth's atmosphere and burning it up. But, this is not a new thing. I mean, sure, in the very earliest days of spaceflight in the 1960s, spaceflight was all about national prestige or propaganda. Obviously, your space program was doing it for prestige and the other side was doing it for propaganda, right? There was no room for commercial advertising in space. And even today, the national like NASA, right? They basically don't get into commercials in any way. Like NASA, for example, I noticed that they use a ton of Apple hardware, iPads and, iPods and AirPods. They don't mention this at all, but it's everywhere. But going back, the earliest example of space advertising or product placement in space that I can think of is back in 1985 with an experiment that was called the Carbonated Beverage Container Payload, which took the brutality of the 1980s cola wars and took it to space. Coca-Cola wanted to have an astronaut test soda in zero G, and they developed a can and dispenser which would keep it fizzy. But Pepsi found out and they ensured that an alternative cola would be available to the astronauts on orbit. And of course, the companies involved shared images with the world, astronauts using their product in space. But really, carbonated beverages in space is a dubious proposition. First of all, Space Shuttle didn't have a refrigerator, so this was warm cola. Secondly, the thing about carbonated beverage is they contain carbon dioxide, and on Earth, of course, those bubbles, they nucleate, they form, they rise to the surface, and you get this fizz. In zero G, there is no rising to the surface, so the fluid just sort of expands in your stomach, and when you feel that you need to burp, it's going to be a pretty wet burp, right? More like a vomit. But yeah, Coca-Cola would actually fly some other times after that, wildly enough. But yeah, going forwards a little, by the end of the 1980s, of course, the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union is still around, but it is really looking for ways to make money and bring some hard currency into its country. And one way it did this was by selling seats on Soyuz, right? So the Tokyo Broadcasting Corporation in 1990, they paid to fly one of their journalists to the Mir space station. It was Soyuz TM-11, and just looking at the Soyuz on the pad, it had masses of advertising all around the fairing, obviously for Tokyo Broadcasting and Sony. So this mission, it carried Viktor Afanasyev, Musa Manaroy, and Toyohiro Akiyama, right? There was a backup crew member, by the way, who was Ryoko Kikuchi, and she obviously never flew, but she trained. So he flew up for a week, and according to cosmonauts that were there, they had never seen anyone vomit quite so much in their space career. He did return like a week later on Soyuz TM-10 with Gennady Manikov and Gennady Strekalov. And by the way, the TM-11 that he flew up in, that would also return another space tourist, well, not space tourist, but a short-term space participant, which was done for commercial, that would be Helen Sharman, the first British person in space. It's space tourist, wrong word. Commercial space flight participant, maybe. So yeah, this commercial event happened with the help of the Soviet Union, which, In theory, they're supposed to be communist. They weren't supposed to be big on, money-making commercialism, but yeah, they needed the money. Now, flash forwards a few years, it's now the Soviet Union is broken up. It's the Russian Federation and its various satellite states. And at this point, of course, there's no principles to worry about. They just need the money, and there starts to be a ton of advertising. One of the earliest high-profile ones is Pepsi, and they pay millions of dollars in May of 1996 to send a large Pepsi can model to the space station. So there was a pair of cosmonauts, they were going to do an EVA, they put some experiments out there, and right at the end, they return to the airlock and they assemble this large, like 4 foot long soda can of Pepsi. Right? It's like an aluminium frame that is all spring-loaded and nylon sheets covering it, and they send it out into space and they float it around and they take photos with this. And of course, that imagery, that video, ends up getting used by Pepsi in commercials back on Earth. And so about a year later, we get what's considered to be the first proper space commercial, and that is for milk, specifically an Israeli company called Tenuva. And they sent up some milk on a Progress, with their labeling. They got the mission commander, to Vasily Silbiev, to basically read out some lines on video. They had people back in mission control, coordinating with them. And then he was to do this whole scene where he would float the milk in zero G and try to drink from it. And he was incredibly embarrassed by the whole thing. At that time, there was a US astronaut on the station, Jerry Lininger. And the crew were really embarrassed that they had to do this. They waited for him to go to bed before they started shooting any of this. And apparently at one point he got up in the middle of the night and he saw them floating around and trying to drink milk in zero G, and they were just incredibly embarrassed by the whole thing. Now, what's interesting to me about this whole thing is that, the commercial, this happened in 1997. This was launched on a Progress spacecraft soon after the fire with the oxygen generator on Mir, right? The one where they were really getting very close to abandoning Mir because of this problem. They found this stuff, they shot their commercial, and then a few weeks later, after shooting the commercial, the commander was supposed to take this Progress spacecraft and test some new docking guidance system. So he had to fly it out away from the station and then fly it back in and dock it. And that, as you may have guessed by now, was the Progress spacecraft that ended up crashing into the station and depressurizing the Spectre module, right? So this was like peak Mir disaster era, and they were shooting multiple commercials. Apparently there was also a bag of rolled gold pretzels which were sent up, and Jerry Lininger had been craving pretzels, but he was told he couldn't have them, and this was for some commercial. I have never seen any footage which implies that this was ever made or was ever included. There is actually like a 1997 zero G pretzels commercial, but it's all clearly shot in the studio with wire work instead. So that's pretty wild. Running things forwards a little. How about advertising on your rockets? I mean, we already saw the Tokyo Broadcasting rocket, but how about the International Space Station? One of the core modules, of course, is Zvezda, right? This is the one that provides the power, it provides the propulsion when there's no Progress on board. Well, in 2000, that was going to be launched on a Proton rocket, and Pizza Hut wanted to put their logo on the side of this historic launch. Well, it actually turned into quite a legal mess for the Russian Space Agency, because they had apparently granted exclusive advertising rights to one group who had basically sat on their butts and not done anything. And Pizza Hut instead negotiated with the Space Agency, and they negotiated with the rocket maker. And there was a whole lot of threats of lawsuits and whatever. But in the end, Pizza Hut got their logo on a rocket which launched a critical part of the space station. And soon after this, they did actually send up a small pizza, like a 6-inch pepperoni pizza, which the Russian crew on the space station, they got to photograph and they got to act like they were eating it. They probably got to enjoy a pizza in space. That's a cool idea. But interestingly enough, the only way this could have reached the space station at the time this happened was if it flew up on a space shuttle. And NASA loves to document everything that was flying on their space shuttles, but in this case, there was no mention made of this pie in the sky stunt. But yeah, I think the most interesting space commercial was in 2006, where Mikhail Tyuryn went on an EVA and became the first person to play golf on orbit. So yeah, he wasn't the first space golfer. That obviously is an honor held by Alan Shepard on the moon. But this was like the 45th anniversary or 35th anniversary of that event. So yeah, he did a commercial for a Canadian company, I think, called Element 21, which made golf clubs that used an alloy based on scandium, because of course scandium is element number 21. They had like a special golf tee and a special golf ball. He had to climb out onto the end of the space station and hit this ball. Now the ball went backwards along the orbit because first of all, if you're hitting a ball in space, you don't want it to come back and hit the space station. And the safest way to do that was to shoot it backwards along the orbit. But equally, yeah, they had to shoot it backwards because this was only allowed to be done on the Russian segment of the station. NASA wasn't happy with this at all, but it was the Russian segment of the station, so they couldn't exactly stop it. So yeah, he could only hit the ball he could only hold the club using one hand. Spacesuits are not particularly suited to getting a good golf swing. Not that I would know anything about it. And of course, in deep space, you can't really put your weight into it. So look, I guess what I'm saying is there's a long history of space commercials, and we're probably just going to see more and more. It's actually interesting that, for example, the FAA and the FCC explicitly will not give launch licenses for any commercial payload which is supposed to be visible to people on Earth. Like if you could see something in space that looked like it spelled out letters or pictures or figures, that would not actually be permitted to fly under US rules. But there's no guarantee that some other country wouldn't fly this at one point. There was an idea at some point, I believe in the 90s, for a French artist who wanted to fly a giant ring of balloons that would be visible from the ground. I'm glad that never happened. Yeah, and China, of course, they're getting in on it. One of their recent missions, I saw like a little cup noodle thing hanging out on the side of one of their spacecraft. And hey, if you remember, there was a gnome flown on an Electron rocket, right? That was sort of like an ad for Valve, but not really. But I sort of dug it, I remember the gnome from Half-Life 2 episode 2. Yeah, I think that's what it was. So yeah, advertising in space, it's here, it's going to keep on happening. I'm Scott Manley, fly safe.